Welcome to Shadow Evidence, dear listeners. In the bustling warmth of a village tea shop where gossip flows as freely as the kettle, a scandal brews darker than the strongest pot. A missing letter, a whispered quarrel, and a secret laced with bitterness stir the calm into suspicion. Pause a moment before we begin. Riddles are never solved by haste, but by patience and observation. Are you listening in the stillness of the night or during your morning tea? Tell us below. If you're ready for another case, show your support and become part of our mystery-loving community. Now, light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. The market square in Flaxborough looked at its best in the late morning, when the sun had risen high enough to soften the granite greys of its buildings into something approaching charm. On this particular Thursday, the usual trade in socks, frying pans, and dubious vegetables was brisk. Pensioners leaned on sticks to inspect apples with expressions usually reserved for autopsies, while the younger housewives conducted business with the briskness of generals counting troops. It was in this lively setting that the new municipal tea shop, the Queen's Rest, had been unveiled by the Borough Council. The tea shop was intended to lend dignity to the square, replacing the battered pie cart that had for decades dispensed hot tea and cold sarcasm in equal measure. The councillors, at least, declared themselves satisfied. Lace curtains, laminated menus, and a shining brass urn gave the establishment a respectability that the pie cart had never aspired to. Mrs. Ethel Phipps, its manager and already something of a legend in Flaxborough for her capacity to extract gossip as efficiently as she dispensed scones, presided behind the counter with the commanding air of a duchess. For 2 weeks she had managed with heroic zeal to keep the whole enterprise from collapsing into chaos. But on this day, calamity struck. At 11:30, the queue waiting for custard tarts suddenly erupted into whispers, gasps, and then a prolonged silence broken only by the scrape of teaspoons. Someone had discovered, in the custard tart he had been served, not the usual sprinkling of nutmeg, but what looked suspiciously like a small scrap of blue envelope paper. The unfortunate customer, Mr. Sidney Croom, a retired solicitor of punctilious habits and less amiable temper, held up the offending fragment as though it were prima facie evidence of treason. His outrage rose further when a second diner, Miss Gertrude Flack, church organist and scourge of the Women's Guild, announced in ringing tones that her tart contained something altogether worse, a dead wasp. The uproar that followed would not have disgraced a theatre. Chairs scraped, voices rose, and Mrs. Phipps, crimson with indignation, declared that such things were impossible under her supervision. "We sterilise, we sift, and we sprinkle, ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "but we do not harbour wasps." Miss Flack, however, was not to be silenced. She insisted on holding the tart aloft, wasp embedded, as though displaying relics of a martyred saint. A small crowd gathered at the window, drawn by the prospect of scandal. By the time Councillor Grimmett, whose devotion to municipal projects was matched only by his dislike of Mrs. Phipps's tongue, had bustled in, the affair had grown to proportions worthy of national disaster. He demanded that the day's batch of custard tarts be withdrawn at once, and hinted darkly that the council's Health and Hygiene Committee would have something to say about this lapse. Mrs. Phipps replied with a ferocity that left even Grimmett momentarily abashed. "You'll not turn my tea shop into a circus, councillor, not while I've breath left to scold you with the urn." The confrontation might have escalated to physical combat had not Inspector Purbright, strolling across the market square on his way back from an interview of no great importance, paused at the doorway of the tea shop. The inspector was not a man who sought excitement. He had learned that in Flaxborough it was better to let excitement find him. Taking in the scene with a gaze as mild as milk, he allowed the torrent of accusation and defence to exhaust itself, before inquiring in tones of gentle curiosity, "And what precisely is the trouble here?" Mr. Croom thrust forward his bit of blue paper. Miss Flack advanced her tart. Mrs. Phipps clutched the counter as though it were the last bastion of civilization. Councillor Grimmett began a speech that sounded suspiciously like the opening arguments at a public inquiry. Purbright examined the evidence without comment. Then he returned the paper to Croom and the tart to Flack with a courteous nod. "Unfortunate," he said, "but it seems to me a matter best settled with a broom and a waste-bin." "Inspector," cried Grimmett indignantly, "this is sabotage. It's an attack on municipal dignity, a crime against the ratepayers." Purbright's smile was faint, almost sympathetic. "In Flaxborough, Councillor dignity often has a very brief shelf life. The remark did nothing to calm the parties involved, but it had the useful effect of dispersing the crowd. Still, the whisper of scandal would linger. Already several patrons had resolved to recount the affair with embellishments at luncheon, and Miss Flack, never one to waste an opportunity, looked forward to retelling her ordeal in organ practice for years to come. For Purbright, the incident might have ended there, but as he stepped back into the square, he found himself reflecting that Flaxborough's scandals were seldom accidents. They were, more often than not, careful little contrivances, and while a wasp in a tart was hardly treason, it was precisely the kind of drama that revealed something more enduring beneath the surface of small-town life: ambition, rivalry, and the dangerous pleasure of bringing others down a peg. He decided, therefore, to keep a quiet eye on the Queen's Rest. In Flaxborough, one never knew when a custard tart might prove more than a dessert. By the following morning, the matter of the contaminated custard tarts had spread through Flaxborough with a speed that would have alarmed the medical officer of health had it been influenza. The town, however, preferred this kind of infection. Gossip required no inoculation, only ears, and those were plentiful. At the hairdresser's in North Street, Miss Ivy Stoker was solemnly informing her regulars that the wasp had been alive when Miss Flack bit into her tart, and that the poor woman had been stung on the tongue. Mrs. Henshaw, having been there herself, corrected this point with relish. She screamed loud enough, dear, but not from a sting, from excitement. You could tell by the way she waved it about, like a flag at a parade. Meanwhile, in the snug of the Lord Banbury Arms, Mr. Mounts the draper had declared that the piece of blue paper discovered by Croom bore unmistakable traces of handwriting. It was part of a note, he insisted, a secret message smuggled into the tea shop and meant for someone else entirely. The fact that Sidney Croom found it proves nothing. He'd have made an exhibit out of a breadcrumb if it suited him. Mrs. Teal landlady leaned across the counter and whispered in mock horror, "A love note, do you suppose? Who in Flaxborough could be carrying on like that under Mrs. Phipps's nose?" The speculation spread with renewed vigour. Some claimed the sabotage was deliberate, part of a plot to discredit Mrs. Phipps. Others suggested her reputation for prying had finally provoked revenge. By lunchtime, the Health and Hygiene Committee had convened an emergency meeting in the Mayor's parlour, though no one could say precisely what was to be investigated beyond a wasp, a tart, and the bruised dignity of several local dignitaries. Inspector Purbright, who had begun his day with a quiet cup of tea at the station, listened politely as Sergeant Malley gave him a blow-by-blow account of the rumour cycle. Malley, whose appetite for scandal was almost professional, finished by remarking that half the town reckons Mrs. Phipps will be closed down before Sunday. Purbright smiled into his cup. "If gossip alone could close a business, Sergeant, I fear there'd be little left standing in Flaxborough except the undertakers." Nevertheless, he took his hat and ambled back towards the Queen's Rest. It was part of his method never to interfere too soon, but rather to observe the direction in which the town's chatter flowed. Experience had taught him that when tongues wagged vigorously enough, they often flapped against the guilty. Mrs. Phipps greeted him that morning with the stoicism of a woman preparing to repel a siege. The lace curtains had been starched to an almost military precision. The urn gleamed as though burnished with indignation, and a fresh tray of tarts sat beneath a domed cover, untouched. "You'll be wanting to inspect, I suppose, Inspector," she said, with the faintest sniff. Purbright considered the tray. "Not just yet. Have many customers risked their digestion this morning?" "Fewer than usual," she admitted. "Though the ones who did were perfectly satisfied. I'll have you know, I made certain each tart was personally overseen. No wasps, no paper, not even a speck of dust." "Most reassuring," he lowered his voice. "And what do you think of it all, Mrs. Phipps?" "Accident or design?" She hesitated, then pursed her lips. "Inspector, nothing in this town happens by accident, not if it concerns me." That remark hung in the air with curious weight. It was not boastful, rather the weary conclusion of a woman who had lived long enough in Flaxborough to know its appetite for spite. As he left, Purbright encountered Councillor Grimmett coming up the steps with the stride of a man about to demand satisfaction. Their brief exchange, Grimmett declaring that sabotage was certain, Purbright responding with mild scepticism, only confirmed to the inspector that this matter would not fade away like yesterday's cream buns. By late afternoon, more tales had been added to the stew. It was said that the scrap of blue paper matched the notepaper used in the town clerk's office, though no one explained how such a detail had been ascertained. Miss Flack, too, had been heard declaring that the wasp was no ordinary insect, but drugged, Inspector, positively drugged to keep it still until the fatal moment. Purbright allowed these stories to settle like dregs in a teacup. He had seen similar patterns before, a trifling irregularity, seized upon by those eager to embroider, becoming suddenly the hinge on which reputations turned. He resolved to interview the main players quietly, one at a time. That evening, the first opportunity came when he encountered Sidney Croom leaving the club. The retired solicitor adjusted his scarf with the offended dignity of a man still awaiting a formal apology from the universe. "Most distressing business, Inspector," he said, before Purbright could even broach the subject. "I have kept the fragment, of course. A lawyer does not discard evidence." "Most prudent," Purbright murmured. "Might I see it again?" Croom produced a small envelope from his coat pocket. Inside lay the scrap of paper, now even smaller after Croom had trimmed its edges neatly. Purbright examined it under the gaslight. True, it bore faint traces of ink, though not enough to form a word. He returned it with a nod. "And in your view, Mr. Croom?" he asked. "A simple mistake." Croom's reply was immediate. "No mistake. Malice, Inspector. Someone has sought to bring ridicule upon the council's establishment, and by extension, upon those of us who supported it." It was precisely the sort of conclusion Purbright had expected, one that revealed more of Croom's vanity than of the affair itself. Still, it was useful to know which sentiments were circulating among the respectable classes. Later that night, back in his office, Purbright sat quietly with his pipe, reflecting. A wasp and a scrap of paper might be dismissed as trifles elsewhere, but in Flaxborough they had the potential to topple a tea shop, embarrass a council, and entertain a populace. He suspected that someone, somewhere in town, was enjoying the spectacle rather more than they ought. The inspector smiled faintly. Scandal, after all, was never wasted in Flaxborough. It was simply another form of recreation, and he had no doubt that before long it would provide him with something rather more substantial than custard tarts. Before noon, the Health and Hygiene Committee had contrived, with that economy for which small bodies are famous, to turn a routine fact-finding into a public hearing. No invitation had been issued. Nevertheless, the mayor's parlour brimmed with persons who had business there, only in the sense that curiosity employs everyone. Miss Flack occupied a chair as if it were a witness box. Mr. Sidney Croom sat bolt upright with a sealed envelope on his knee like a writ. Councillor Grimmett arranged his features into a portrait of civic rectitude, and Mrs. Phipps, hat at an angle suitable for bombardment, stood by the fireplace refusing the luxury of a seat. Inspector Purbright, who had not been summoned but had been expected, took a modest place near the window with Sergeant Malley beside him, eyes bright as a dog at a picnic. The chairman, a gentleman whose moustache had learnt to speak before he did, called the meeting to order and invited plain statements, free of embroidery. He then turned at once to Miss Flack, thereby guaranteeing the opposite. Miss Flack rose, clasped the offending tart, enclosed since yesterday in greaseproof like a small saint in cellophane, and gave an account in which the wasp hovered with operatic intention before choosing martyrdom at her lips. She concluded by declaring that the creature had been drugged or chloroformed. There was a dullness about it, and sat down amid a rustle of awe that was not entirely respectful. Croom followed, producing the blue scrap with the air of introducing Exhibit A to the Old Bailey. He had trimmed it since so that what might once have been a triangle now aspired to a polygon. Plainly from a council envelope, he said, "The very texture, note the blue, suggests officialdom. There is faint writing. I make out the tail of an R and perhaps a figure 2. A message, beyond question." Mrs. Phipps was last. She did not testify as president. "Gentlemen," she began, though the room contained several indignant ladies, "I will not have my kitchen spoken of as if it were a ditch. We sift, we scald, we cover, and we do not write notes. If others do, they bring their own paper." A murmur of partisan applause rose from that portion of the audience who had always suspected Councillor Grimmett of preferring misfortune if it could be municipal. Grimmett stood to enjoy himself. "The public trust, madam, is at stake. This establishment, being a borough facility, must be above reproach. I therefore move that it be shut pending a full inspection." At which moment the parlour door opened a cautious inch, and a small boy in an apron peered in. "Begging your pardon," he said to the universe, "There's a parcel coming for the committee, left at the Teashop with our compliments." He advanced, placed on the table a neat brown package secured with fierce string, and fled before gratitude could entangle him. Grimmett hesitated. Authority is always uncertain with parcels, then undid the knots. Inside lay 3 custard tarts, each neatly papered round with a ring of blue. Miss Flack emitted the kind of noise that invites attention from a great distance. "Evidence!" she cried, with a conviction scarcely dimmed by the fact that the blue was raffia-dyed doily paper, cut from what the Queen's Rest used under cups. Purbright leaned to Mally. "A thoughtful donor," he murmured. "One who believes proof improves with repetition." The room dissolved into opinion. Was it mockery? A confession? A threat? Only the chairman remembered his moustache's promise of order, and banged a paperweight to little effect. Purbright did not intervene. He watched. There is a point at which a theatrical person cannot resist adding one more line. It is always useful to know where this point lies. When the uproar had exhausted itself, the chairman announced gravely that a formal inspection of the Queen's Rest would occur at 2:00. There was a small stampede. Flaxborough understood that the matinee would continue on site. It did, and in more than one act. The kitchen of the Queen's Rest, subjected to scrutiny usually reserved for coroners, proved dismayingly sensible. The floors were clean, the covers were on, the nutmeg sat chastely in a tin correctly labelled. Mrs. Phipps's assistant, a thin, capable girl called Dotty Pike, submitted to questions without either pleasure or fear. "Wasps?" Grimmett demanded, with the air of cross-examining an apiary. "One yesterday," Dotty admitted. "Came in with the morning lot when I lifted the window for steam. I clapped a bowl over it and sent it out again. It was lively enough to complain." "And paper?" "This is from Croom, who had brought his polygon to bear like a compass." "Blue doilies for undercups," Dotty said, pointing to a stack. "Proper council envelopes, number we get our bills in them, mind. I use those to make the leg of the prep table behave." She lifted a corner, a folded blue wedge propped to wobble into politeness. Purbright's eye lingered there a heartbeat longer than respect required. "Practical," he said. "Did anyone bring a letter into the kitchen yesterday?" Dotty thought. Pressed her lips, then nodded. "A man, midday, said, 'For Mrs. Phipps, private.' I popped it on the far shelf and told him she was in the shop. When I looked later it was gone. Thought she'd fetch it." Mrs. Phipps, hearing, compressed indignation and puzzlement into one syllable. "Letter? Number? Describe him?" Purbright asked. "Hat. Neutral," Dotty said apologetically, meaning the sort of hat and the sort of man Flaxborough specialises in. "Smelt faint of hair oil. He didn't look around. Knew where not to." Mally scribbled, delighted by the birth of a suspect who might be anyone with hair and a hat. "Who knew about the inspection?" Purbright went on. "Half the square by now," Mrs. Phipps said grimly. He allowed himself no more than a nod. A kitchen that tells the truth has a particular silence. He heard it now. He asked to see the bin. Dotty obliged, producing a sack that breathed onion and yesterday. Halfway down, Purbright found a blue slip torn from a doily, not an envelope, dusted with nutmeg by proximity. He held it briefly under his nose and smelt not almond nor glue, but a whiff of paraffin, the kind with which Mr. Hodge the tailor favoured his iron. Interesting, but not yet useful. "Your wasp," Purbright said to Miss Flack, who had drifted back to the threshold like Conscience with gloves on. "Sat in this kitchen only when it came under a bowl, alive. A wasp dead enough to pose would need to arrive otherwise. Do you keep a collection?" Miss Flack coloured in a manner approaching artistry. "Certainly not." "Then we must look to those who keep all sorts of collections, including grievances," Purbright said mildly. "Mr. Bates, perhaps." The name travelled faster than he had intended to say it. Mr. Bates had operated the displaced pie cart. He now dispensed sandwiches from a barrow 2 streets away and a sense of injustice from everywhere else. He arrived, summoned by rumour, before anyone could go in search of him, a strong man reduced at the edges by loss of steam and licence. "I don't wish the lady harm," he said to Purbright, solidarity and spite struggling for custody of his voice. "But some people fancy themselves in lace. I did no wasp work." "Of course," Purbright said. "Your wasps were always honest. Drawn, I am told, by the jam and not the politics." The inspection concluded with no triumphs for Grimmett beyond a stern recommendation about window nets. The crowd, denied scandal, made do with a narrative. which is nearly as good. Purbright let them have it. He returned to the tea shop in the lull before the afternoon's second wave and asked, as if it were a triviality to see the storeroom, in the dim back space, shelves, flour, the large brown tins of municipal catering. He found what he expected and something he had not. What he expected was a suggestion box unlocked, containing 3 compliments, 2 demands for cheaper tea, and a cutting from the Mercury advising the council to leave pies to those who knew them. What he had not expected was a small handbill tucked behind the tins, advertising the grand reopening of Mr. Bates's evening cart, should sufficient custom assert itself, printed on coarse blue stock. He slipped it back where it had been. It explained too much to be true yet, and not enough to be useful now. On his way out, he paused at the counter where a fresh tray of tarts awaited their fate. The nutmeg dusting was even, the pastry unaffected by tragedy, the custard smooth as diplomacy. He tapped the shaker. 2 holes, not 3. He weighed it in his hand and returned it with a private thought. Yesterday's dusting on Miss Flack's tart had been thick and unkind. A 3-hole dredger does. The old pie cart had used one, he recalled, as liberally as its proprietor used sarcasm. By late afternoon, the town had already upgraded the hearing into legend. 3 tarts, blue as policemen, a child told another with joy. In the Arms, it was asserted that Purbright had sniffed the paper and proclaimed it municipal treason. At the hairdresser's, that Mrs. Phipps had flung a wasp at Councillor Grimmett, who had swallowed it with an apology. The inspector carried the improvements quietly. He sat with his pipe by the open office window, letting Mally's bulletins blow past him like confetti. Only once did he write, briefly and without flourish. Paper that wants to be seen, a wasp that wants to be believed, hands that prefer a crowd. He underlined nothing. Then he put on his hat again and took the quiet way around the square. The Queen's Rest glowed. Inside, Mrs. Phipps carved slices of dignity with her cake knife. Outside, Mr. Bates's barrow attracted the faithful with the sombre aroma of pickled beetroot. As he paused where he could observe both, a small event occurred that pleased him. A girl of 12 with a school satchel bought a tart from Mrs. Phipps, carried it halfway across the square, and then, persuaded by loyalty or thrift, turned back and exchanged it for a ham sandwich at Mr. Bates's. In the transaction, nothing terrible happened, no wasp, no paper. Only a look, quick as a match, passed between Bates and the girl. Conspiracy's younger, less guilty cousin. Mischief. Purbright smiled. Mischief was the right size for his case. Men who wanted ruin did not trouble tarts. Men who wanted laughter did not send letters into kitchens. Somewhere in between, someone was staging acts for a particular audience. Whoever they were, they would not be able to resist one more scene. He would therefore provide a stage. "Sergeant," he said to Mally when he returned, "tomorrow morning I shall ask Mrs. Phipps to hold a free tasting of her custard at 11. A health committee member will attend, preferably one who enjoys being observed, and you will stand by the back door and watch for hats smelling faintly of hair. Oil." "Right, sir," Mally said, thrilled at the idea of an ambush by pudding. Purbright tamped his pipe and allowed himself the rare indulgence of certainty. A person who scattered blue scraps would come, if only to improve the arrangement, and a person who had once handled a dead wasp would sooner or later reveal a pocket that smelt faintly of camphor. Outside, Flaxborough arranged itself for the evening, pleased with the day's work of having almost discovered something. Inside, Purbright composed himself for tomorrow's discovery of something smaller but sufficient. The kind of detail that stood, polite and patient, at the hinge between mischief and malice. The following morning broke with that particular shade of damp light Flaxborough reserved for weekdays, the sort that persuaded people they had better things to do indoors, preferably somewhere with boiled water close at hand. 11 o'clock found the Queen's Rest prepared with unusual cheer. Mrs. Phipps had produced a row of custard tarts so symmetrical, they looked as if they had been drilled on parade. She stood behind them, apron starched to near weaponry, expressing a warning to any who might suggest the kitchen from which they came was less than immaculate. A little crowd had already formed. Curiosity, sharpened by yesterday's theatrics in the council parlour, had proved stronger than caution. Even those who had whispered about poison pastry now seemed willing to risk a morsel if it was free. Councillor Grimmett had contrived to be present in his official chain, though not strictly required, arguing that the public expected oversight. His chain glinted as he leaned over the counter with all the solemnity of a judge about to examine evidence. Inspector Purbright, pipe unlit but tucked in his palm, observed from a corner table with Sergeant Malley near the back door. The inspector appeared placid, almost benign, yet his eyes lingered carefully upon each figure that approached. He was not particularly interested in those who eagerly reached for the tarts. Rather, he watched the ones who hesitated, who measured the room before they moved, who looked perhaps for an audience. Miss Flack, whose lips had yesterday borne the full sting of scandal, arrived swathed in scarves as though the incident had threatened her lungs. She insisted on making a speech before tasting anything, announcing her forgiveness of Mrs. Phipps, but recommending greater vigilance against the insect menace. The remark earned her a curt nod from Mrs. Phipps and a whispered chorus from the queue behind, suggesting that Miss Flack had long been vigilant against any menace except her own. The first custard tart was bitten into by a retired postmaster, who immediately declared it unusually smooth and looked around for affirmation. The second disappeared into a child whose sticky grin reassured the company more effectively than any certificate. Applause followed, scattered but genuine, until someone pointed out that eating tarts did not of itself prove them harmless, and that perhaps a volunteer ought to wait 10 minutes before others followed. At this, a ripple of unease returned, and the crowd shuffled uncertainly. Purbright rose, smiling faintly, and took a tart himself. "I assure you," he said, "police officers are encouraged to take risks in the line of duty." He ate the custard with slow appreciation, and after a moment's silence the others resumed eating with the enthusiasm of people reassured not by science but by spectacle. During this small carnival, Malley reported a sighting at the back door. A man in a trilby paused by the alleyway window, peered in briefly and walked on. "Quick, deliberate," Malley murmured to Purbright later. "Didn't linger like a customer." The sergeant had noted a faint oily sheen where the hat brushed the window frame, though this observation might have owed as much to imagination as to light. The inspector did not hurry after the figure. He had counted upon such a moment and preferred to allow his quarry the comfort of believing himself unseen. Instead, Purbright returned to the counter and asked Mrs. Phipps, in a tone audible enough for surrounding ears, whether any letters had arrived that morning. "No," she replied firmly, "and if they had, they would have come straight to me." Yet scarcely 10 minutes later one did appear. Dotty Pike, the assistant, discovered a folded slip pushed beneath the sugar sacks. She handed it across the counter without comment, though her glance toward the inspector suggested she suspected more of the world than she had yesterday. The slip was again blue, though not doily this time, but the thick stock used for circulars. On it, in shaky pencil, 3 words: "Watch the nutmeg." Mrs. Phipps gave a sharp exclamation of disgust, while Grimmett seized the paper as though it were a warrant. "Sabotage! Clear sabotage," he announced. "This is nothing less than an attempt to destroy confidence in our municipal facilities." Purbright accepted the note from him with polite patience. He turned it once between his fingers, then tucked it into his pocket without remark. The crowd, deprived of spectacle, began drifting away, many of them clutching their free tarts as insurance against disappointment. Later, in the quiet of his office, the inspector laid out the blue scraps, the polygon, the doily, and now this warning. Malley perched opposite, enthusiasm bubbling. "Sir, it's got to be Bates. He's the only one with reason. He's losing his customers to the Queen's Rest, so he's framing them. That note could be his handwriting. He's heavy-handed with nutmeg, too. We've heard it from plenty." Purbright tamped his pipe thoughtfully. "Motives are rarely so straightforward, Sergeant. Mr. Bates has grievances, certainly. But to arrange such a theatrical campaign requires an audience. He does not strike me as a man who cares. Much for drama." "Then who does, sir?" The inspector did not answer. He was considering the fact that each incident, the wasp, the package of tarts, the sudden notes, had been timed for maximum attention, as though orchestrated not to ruin Mrs. Phipps, but to entertain the town. The saboteur, if that was the right term, seemed less concerned with consequence than with applause. That afternoon, he called upon Mr. Bates nonetheless, finding him in his barrow, ladling beetroot with gloomy industry. Bates greeted him without surprise. "You'll want to know if I've been poking wasps into pastry or scribbling nasty notes. I haven't. My quarrels plan. The council stole my trade, but I don't skulk about kitchens." "Notes have appeared," Purbright said gently. One this morning suggested the nutmeg was at fault. Bates snorted. That'll be some wag with more time than wit. Half this town thrives on nutmeg. Ask Mrs. Fothergill. She'd sooner die than bake a sponge without it. He paused, eyes narrowing. Unless, of course, somebody wants it thought poisonous. The remark echoed a thought already forming in Purbright's mind. He thanked Bates and walked back slowly to the station. It was not poison he suspected, but performance. Performance with props. A wasp, a slip of paper, a spice jar. Each item small, ordinary, but used as cues in a play meant for Flaxborough's eager audience. That evening, as he passed through the square, the inspector noticed Miss Flack in earnest conversation with Councillor Grimmett outside the library. Their gestures were broad, their heads inclined toward the Queen's Rest. Purbright did not pause, but the image fixed itself in his mind. Two people whose appetite for public indignation often exceeded their appetite for pastry. If someone sought to stir scandal for amusement, it was just such figures who gave it voice and stage. He returned home, considering a question he had asked himself many times in other cases. Did the culprit want damage, or merely noise? Flaxborough's scandal was rarely lethal. But scandal, if allowed to ferment, could become a weapon more effective than any knife. Purbright decided the time had come to see what happened when the theatre lights dimmed and the performer believed himself unobserved. The following day, he resolved, would be dedicated not to more tastings or hearings, but to watching quietly who slipped behind the curtain when the town looked elsewhere. Inspector Purbright began the day as he had promised himself, not with further announcements but with looking. He posted Sergeant Malley in the alley behind the Queen's Rest to observe the invisible end of commerce, deliveries, shortcuts, and the private rearrangements that supported the town's public dignity. He himself took a seat by the teashop window where the bell could do his counting for him. Flaxborough often confessed himself between rings. Early trade was modest. A baker's boy arrived with a basket. Dotty Pike checked his list with the cold efficiency of someone who understood both arithmetic and flour. A tailor's apprentice, cap askew, fingers shiny with paraffin from a pressing iron, brought a bundle of freshly starched cloth for the counter. Mrs. Phipps received these like a dowry. The apprentice left trailing a faint, clean scent that explained yesterday's paraffin on the doily scrap without yet justifying it. Purbright made a note. The smell had drifted through several scenes without belonging to any of them. At 10, he drifted to Wainwright's grocer to ask about nutmeg, and because questions appear less inquisitive when wrapped in purchases, he also bought 2 oranges and a packet of rice. Wainwright, pleased to be useful, provided a small lecture. The Queen's Rest took pre-ground nutmeg and used a 2-holed shaker. Mr. Bates, when he was in business, had preferred a 3-holed dredger for generosity, Inspector. As to customers, Mrs. Fothergill bought whole nutmegs and grated them until the house smelled like an apothecary. Miss Flack, Wainwright added, had lately asked for something to fortify, which turned out to be camphor drops for the nerves. Camphor has many virtues, Purbright observed. It preserves moths from our clothes, and sometimes clothes from our moths. From Wainwright's he crossed to Biddle & Son printers. Mr. Biddle possessed the pious gloom of a man who must daily coax meaning onto paper. He admitted that blue stock, council blue as he called it, was popular. 2 reams had gone to the town clerk the previous month, half a ream to Councillor Grimmett for ratepayers' improvements, a scattering of sheets to the church for choir lists. Mr. Bates, too, bought a cheaper coarse blue for handbills. Ink likes it less, Biddle said sadly, but ink is not asked for its opinion. Nor often given time to form one, Purbright returned. He next found Miss Flack at the church, hands gliding over the organ keys in a penitential fugue that would have mended behaviour if behaviour were repairable by music. When she saw him, she descended with theatrical modesty, reticule clutched like doctrine. "Inspector, you must have news," she breathed. "Only that your camphor is medicinal," he said, glancing at the reticule from which a tiny tin peeped and made its case by smell. "A prudent precaution for the throat." "For the nerves," she corrected with a little shiver. "Yesterday quite undid them." He nodded, and as if noticing nothing, returned the tin she had nearly dropped in her flurry. His fingers caught a corner of blue peeping among music leaves, programme paper, nothing else, and a pencil sharpened to an immodest needle. He did not remark upon either. Organists who collected paper were not yet criminals. They were only useful to criminals. In the afternoon, he visited Mr. Bates on the barrow, whose pickled beetroot possessed the natural solemnity of witnesses. Bates showed him his old dredger, kept like a relic of happier days. 3 holes. The nutmeg, when shaken experimentally, fell in a liberal drift that turned sandwich crusts into geography. "I told you, Inspector," Bates said without invitation. "If I was minded to fight, I'd do it with pickles, not paper." "Pickles leave stains," Purbright said mildly. "Paper leaves stories." Returning to the Queen's Rest in the lull before tea, he asked Dotty Pike quietly whether she had ever taken trays out of the shop for the good of the town. "Only once," Dotty said. "Miss Flax sent for 2 choir ladies who wouldn't climb the steps. I carried them to the porch. She met me there." "And yesterday's free tasting?" he asked. "Who handled the nutmeg?" "Mrs. Phipps only," Dotty said. "She doesn't believe in delegation where sprinkles are concerned." Purbright allowed himself a look at tin. The underside bore a small greasy cross he had marked with his thumb that morning. It was still there. Whatever the note writer had wished folks to watch, the shaker had not moved houses. At 4, he tried Councillor Grimmett, who was exactly where one would expect, at his desk receiving a citizen who'd found something to complain about and wished to deposit it where it could be reproduced. Grimmett's chain lay across a ledger like a ribbon marking a chapter of self-importance. "Inspector," he said, dismissing the citizen with a nod that implied conscription, "we must act. This campaign against the Teashop has a distinct flavour of organisation. I am not afraid to say that Bates is behind it." "Your courage is remarkable," Purbright said with no visible affection. "And your blue circulars? Do they require further sheets?" Grimmett blinked. "How the devil should I know? Ask Biddle." "I have," Purbright said. "He keeps good books." Grimmett's jaw tightened, then relaxed. "Look here, Inspector. Mrs. Phipps is a tyrant. The town pretended to like the pie cart because it preferred a grievance to a standard. Now we have a standard, and they prefer the grievance again. I'm tired of being blamed for offering china to people who enjoy enamel." "A constable's experience," Purbright returned, "is that enamel can be scrubbed without asking permission." He left the councillor to polish indignation and went on to the station, where Mally reported 2 small items. The man with the trilby had been seen again, this time lingering by Biddle's window, and a choir child had bought a tart, taken it to the church steps, and then, out of loyalty or thrift, exchanged it with another child for a toffee in a scuffle. "Nothing criminal, sir," Mally said, disappointed to be so decent. "On the contrary," Purbright said, "everything useful. Mischief prefers thoroughfares." He set out that evening a pattern that pleased him by its modesty. He asked, "Mrs. Phipps tomorrow, to keep 3 tarts aside, undusted, only glazed, to place the nutmeg tin in plain view, and to leave in the storeroom, on the shelf where notes had twice been found, a blank blue slip folded invitingly, along with a pencil whose point he had dullened." He advised Dotty to call loudly, any errand that took her to the back. He asked Mr. Biddle to place in his window a notice that no blue stock would be cut until Monday, owing to reblading, and then to go to dinner with his wife exactly at noon. He requested of Mr. Bates merely that he remain open and look persecuted, a task Bates undertook with no rehearsal. These were not traps so much as courtesies offered to a hand that wished to move without friction. Purbright intended to see whether the hand preferred sharp points, fresh paper, and an audience. If deprived of 2, it might reveal itself in reaching for the 3rd. The last call of the day was to Nora Fothergill, whose cakes swelled like reputations. He asked if she had, by chance, been called upon to donate custards lately for the church or the committee. "Twice," she said. "Once by Miss Flack, an afternoon meeting for the organ fund. Once by Mrs. Phipps for the health committee, though she ended up taking her own. And the nutmeg? Whole, Inspector. Anything already powdered is an admission of defeat." As he turned to go, her cat, fat with wisdom, padded to the door and sat as if to ask whether humans intended to finish their nonsense soon. Purbright stooped to scratch its head and murmured, "Soon. The theatre is closing." Back at his desk he wrote a line he did not underline, camphor to calm, also to keep small corpses, paraffin from irons, blue that wishes to be noticed, dusting heavy as if from 3 holes. He added after a pause, "Some people prefer proof that may be lifted between finger and thumb." Flaxborough began to put its lamps up. The Queen's Rest polished itself into evening. The barrow under Bates's hand shone as much as beetroot can. The printer darkened his window with a neat card about blades, which Miss Peat read and regretted. The church door, obligingly ajar for practice, closed upon Miss Flack's scales that sounded tonight a shade less sure. Purbright extinguished his light with the unhurried confidence of a man who had arranged, not an ambush, but a decent opportunity. If someone had grown addicted to improving scenes, tomorrow would ask them to improve one more, and the improvement, like most last flourishes, would carry its author's name, not in letters, but in habit. By morning, Purbright had positioned himself in a seat not unlike yesterday's, but a fraction closer to the service counter. The Queen's Rest presented itself with the brisk innocence of a shop rehearsing virtue. Mrs. Phipps, fortified by starch and self-belief, hovered near the till. Dotty Pike, obedient as usual, ferried cups and saucers with the careful gait of one who understood porcelain, did not forgive. The first hour provided only minor theatre. 2 matrons discussing who had or had not changed their curtains for spring, a young typist taking her tea with the air of someone waiting for life to begin. Mr. Bates gliding past the window with his barrow, pausing just long enough to ensure those inside remembered he existed. Purbright noted everything without apparent interest, pencil idle against his notebook. At 11:30, the first of the curious arrangements unfolded. Miss Flack entered with her usual ostentation, hat brim like a visor and reticule clutched as if salvation depended upon its strap. She ordered tea and a scone, insisting the scone be lightly kissed with nutmeg for character. Dotty hesitated, looked towards Mrs. Phipps and was met with a curt nod. The tin was lifted, the contents shaken in a perfunctory cloud. Purbright observed carefully. No hand other than Phipps's touched the dredger. When the scone arrived, Miss Flack nibbled and then set it down, coughing delicately. "Over-generous, I fear," she murmured to no one and everyone. "A spice becomes vulgar when it shouts." The remark lingered in the air, half criticism, half advertisement. Customers glanced, Dotty bit her lip, and Mrs. Phipps stiffened. Moments later, Councillor Grimmett bustled in, chain invisible but suggested by posture. He demanded not tea but coffee, black, none of your milky municipal dilution. A tart was placed beside him, again the shaker tapped, again with Mrs. Phipps's hand, though her gesture seemed weightier this time, perhaps from irritation. Grimmett took a bite and grimaced. Strong, determinedly strong, almost as if one were being told off in powder. His eyes fell on Miss Flack, who sniffed. The air was suddenly thick with accusations disguised as culinary reviews. The real event, however, came quietly. While these performances occupied the front, Dotty called out that she must fetch more serviettes. Her voice, at Purbright's request, was pitched deliberately loud. She disappeared through the beaded curtain, leaving the counter for a mere minute. Purbright's gaze, apparently dreamlike, did not miss the hand that moved in that minute. A gentleman in a brown trilby, seen before lingering at Biddle's, approached the shelf near the till, feigning interest in the jars of barley sugar. From his pocket emerged not a handkerchief, but a folded slip of blue paper, which he let fall between 2 jars with the practised negligence of someone planting bulbs. Then, as if to cover the act, he bought a barley sugar twist, tipping his hat to Mrs. Phipps and leaving with studied ordinariness. By the time Dotty returned, the slip was snugly hidden, unnoticed by all but Purbright, who wrote a line in his notebook with the patience of a gardener marking seedlings. He did not stir to retrieve it. The seed was best left to sprout naturally in someone else's hand. Shortly after noon, the printer's notice took effect. A young clerk, sent evidently by Grimmett, poked his head in, inquired of Biddle's window whether blue stock might be purchased, and departed muttering when told Monday. Purbright saw this through the teashop glass. Discontentful energy without product, like smoke without a fire to sting. It was half an hour later that the second show came. Mrs. Fothergill entered, cheeks flushed from oven heat, and ordered 2 custards to test the competition. She was given them in saucers sprinkled once more with nutmeg. She tasted, pursed her lips, and said, "Pity," heavy-handed. Powder belongs to the chemist, not the pudding. Her words were not shouted, but neither were they private. Several patrons, previously loyal, hesitated before ordering. The atmosphere curdled. Mrs. Phipps's mouth pinched thin as pastry edges. Through it all, Purbright remained impassive, though he noted that Miss Flack glanced towards the shelf by the jars as though expecting something. Indeed, after a few minutes she excused herself, rose, and drifted past the counter. Her hand brushed seemingly without intent along the row of jars, and gathered the blue slip. It vanished into her reticule as naturally as a hymn book into a pew. When she resumed her seat, Purbright had closed his notebook. He did not need to know yet what message the slip contained. The fact of its reception was more valuable than its text. He rose, adjusted his hat, and offered Mrs. Phipps a courteous bow of departure. His walk back to the station was slow. On the way, he stopped at Bates's barrow. "Business?" he asked. "As brisk as vinegar allows," Bates replied grimly. "Fothergill passed this way just now, told me Phipps is overspicing. That's her word, Inspector, overspicing. I said I'd rather overspice than undersell." "Then you are safe," Purbright said gently. At the station he found Mally sharpening pencils with excessive zeal. "You'll blunt the knife before you wear down the wood," Purbright remarked. Mally coloured and reported that the Trilby man had been seen boarding a bus towards Fenston. "Didn't look nervous, sir, just tidy." Purbright sat, folded his hands, and allowed silence to take its place. Finally he said, "Tidy people are often the most disruptive. They like to rearrange." That evening, while the town compared notes about Phipps's heavy hand and Bates's eternal grievance, Purbright sat at his desk with 3 objects before him. A slip of blank blue paper that he had collected after Miss Flax's reticule had been left in the cloakroom at choir practice, the nutmeg dredger with its telltale 3-hole dusting, borrowed with Phipps's permission, and the half-dulled pencil Mally had abandoned. Together they made a kind of still life, not evidence for a courtroom, but enough for a policeman who believed behaviour spoke louder than any affidavit. He drew one neat line in his notebook. Tomorrow, the hand will be asked to sign its work. The town prepared for Sunday service. Purbright prepared for revelation. Both looked outwardly calm. Sunday morning brought its familiar medley of bells, coughs, and shoes polished hurriedly on doormats. The parishioners of Flaxborough drifted towards St. Luke's, each carrying not only their prayer books, but their week's worth of carefully cultivated opinions. The nutmeg scandal still spiced up every conversation. Inspector Purbright, while never one to overstate his own piety, had taken a seat towards the back of the nave. He found churches useful, not for confessions, those were rarely forthcoming in Flaxborough, but for observing the curious social manoeuvres people performed when obliged to sit beside neighbours with whom they were at odds. Mrs. Fothergill, square and formidable, installed herself directly in view of Mrs. Phipps, whose lips pursed so tightly one might have thought she had sealed them with her own pastry crimper. Miss Flax sat a little off to the side, her reticule clasped on her lap like a relic, and Grimmett, radiating self-importance, occupied the pew nearest the aisle, as if chairing a committee on spiritual improvement. The vicar, Reverend Teversham, delivered a homily on temperance and restraint, topics which, under the circumstances, might have been chosen deliberately. To be moderate in all things, he said, is to give space for grace. The words seemed to roll heavily towards Mrs. Phipps, who sniffed audibly. Across the nave, Mrs. Fothergill gave a small, satisfied cough, but it was not in the sermon that Purbright found his interest sharpened. Rather, it was in the choir loft, where Miss Flax's reticule, deposited while she sang her quavering soprano, had been moved twice in the course of one hymn. The first time it was set neatly upon a chair, the second, when Purbright happened to glance upward, it lay at a slight angle as though someone had rummaged. The inspector noted the timing, precisely during the offertory hymn, when every eye was expected to be fixed dutifully upon the brass plate being passed. After the service, the customary mingling took place in the churchyard. Conversations began with inquiries after health, but swiftly pivoted to nutmeg and tea shops. "I must say," Mrs. Fothergill pronounced to an assembled trio of ladies, "that heavy-handedness betrays a guilty conscience. People conceal carelessness beneath excess." She adjusted her bonnet with the certainty of one whose words required no rebuttal. Mrs. Phipps, who had joined the group uninvited, interjected coolly, "It is not the spoon that sins, but the tongue that tattles." The remark, crisp as short crust, left an awkward silence into which Miss Flack glided, offering a benign smile. "I dare say," she said airily, "that nutmeg is hardly a matter for ecclesiastical division, though," and here she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "one must admit the spice has been used as code before. The Dutch, you know, wars were fought over less." The ladies looked suitably impressed at this suggestion of international intrigue, though Purbright, passing by, allowed himself a faintly amused sigh. Flaxborough's imagination had always been larger than its grasp. The afternoon found Purbright once again at the station, where Sergeant Malley reported in tones of disbelief that the trilby-wearing gentleman had returned on the midday bus and been seen buying boiled sweets at a tobacconist's. "Sweets, sir? No papers or such, just a bag of humbugs." "Even humbugs can carry a message," Purbright murmured. Malley blinked. "You mean code?" Purbright did not answer, preferring instead to draw a small sketch in his notebook. A jar, a slip of paper, a hand. He then closed the book, as though the matter were sufficiently clear to himself if not to anyone else. Later that evening, an incident occurred that was to provide both comic relief and further complication. The choir held its practice in the vestry, and it was during the second hymn, "Abide with Me," sung with more gusto than accuracy, that Miss Flax's reticule slipped from the chair beside her and burst open upon the stone floor. Out tumbled a collection of items, a handkerchief, a small mirror, peppermint lozenges, and, most importantly, several slips of blue paper folded into neat rectangles. The sight of those papers, so unmistakably akin to the disputed printing stock, sent a ripple through the choir. One tenor halted mid-note. The organist lost his place. Miss Flack herself bent swiftly to gather them, cheeks flushed but voice continuing bravely on the line. "Help of the helpless, oh abide with me." Purbright, who had slipped into the vestry on the pretext of discussing hymn lists with the vicar, saw enough to confirm what he had suspected. The messages were moving not just into, but through Miss Flack's keeping. Whether she was a courier or conspirator remained to be learned. He allowed her to collect her belongings without intervention. The embarrassment of exposure in front of fellow choristers was punishment enough for the moment, and, more importantly, it guaranteed gossip would spread faster than any police announcement. By the following morning, half the town would believe Miss Flack had been smuggling contraband from the Low Countries, while the other half would insist she was merely absent-minded. Either way, tongues would wag, and wagging tongues often untangle knots better than official rope. That night, Purbright sat by his lamp and considered the day's accumulation. The nutmeg dredger. Too much powder at the wrong times, always in Phipps's hand, but never conclusively her doing. The blue slips, planted by one hand, retrieved by another, scattered in yet another's possession, and all of it circled around the Teashop, as though the Queen's Rest were less a refreshment room than a stage upon which half the town played. He leaned, back, steepling his fingers. If the matter had been mere commercial rivalry, it would have resolved in tart comments and counter-advertisements. But here was choreography, too neat, too deliberate to be left to accident. Someone was orchestrating mischief, if not worse, and the players were willingly or unwittingly providing accompaniment. The inspector closed his eyes briefly, listening to the tick of the clock. It was not, he thought, a matter of discovering who hated whom. That was a universal condition in Flaxborough. But of discerning whose hatred had been disciplined into pattern. Tomorrow, he decided, he would ask Mrs. Phipps not about nutmeg or paper, but about loyalty. It was often the less measurable commodity that explained why hands sprinkled too much or too little, why slips were passed, and why scandals bloomed like weeds between paving stones. The lamp hissed faintly as he extinguished it. Outside, the town settled under its Sunday quiet, but inside the inspector's mind, the investigation moved forward with deliberate calm. Monday morning arrived with its usual medley of clattering milk bottles and the faint tang of coal smoke. Yet in Flaxborough the air seemed charged, as if the town itself had leaned forward to hear what would be said next. Gossip from the choir incident had, as Purbright predicted, spread with both speed and embroidery. By breakfast time, at least 4 versions of Miss Flack's humiliation were in circulation. One had her papers blown across the nave like autumn leaves, another insisted she had shrieked in panic, while a third claimed she had fainted upon the organ pedals and produced a cacophony. The plain truth, that she had blushed and gathered her reticule, was far too meagre to satisfy a community with so much appetite for scandal. Purbright, arriving at the station with his usual unhurried gait, found Sergeant Malley already primed with the morning's harvest of chatter. "They say, sir," Malley reported, "that Miss Flack's slips were actually recipes for Dutch cakes, the sort that requires nutmeg, if you take my meaning." "I do," said Purbright mildly, "though I suspect the Dutch have survived centuries of cooking without Miss Flack's aid." Malley grinned, though uncertainly, sensing the inspector's dry rebuke. "Still, it sets people talking. Some are saying she's in league with Mrs. Phipps, others that she's trying to undermine her." "And which do you suppose is more probable, Sergeant?" Malley considered. "Well, sir, Given the state of Miss Flack's sponge cakes at last year's fete, I'd say she's incapable of undermining anybody." The inspector allowed himself the ghost of a smile before turning to his desk. A fresh note awaited him there, forwarded from the post office. It was an anonymous letter written in a cramped and uneven hand. "Inspector Purbright," it began, "if you value the truth about the tea shop, you will pay heed to the hymn book. There is more in it than Rock of Ages." The inspector read it twice, then folded it neatly. The letter bore the unmistakable odour of theatricality, the kind of hint dropped by someone who wished to be thought a conspirator, but who might only be a mischievous parishioner. Still, he tucked it into his breast pocket. Even nonsense had a way of pointing to sense if one let it simmer long enough. Later that morning, he visited Mrs. Phipps at Queen's Rest. The tea shop, though polished and tidy as ever, seemed subdued. A few customers lingered over cups of weak tea, murmuring in the tones of those pretending not to discuss scandal. Mrs. Phipps herself stood at the counter, erect and unsmiling, as though the very notion of disgrace could be deflected by firmness of spine. "Inspector," she said with a thin smile, "I hope you've come for refreshment rather than interrogation. We've had quite enough of the latter from idle tongues." Purbright accepted a seat at a corner table. "Merely to observe, Mrs. Phipps, though if you would spare me a few words I'd be grateful." She poured his tea with precise movements, her hands betraying the slightest tremor. "The matter of the nutmeg," he began gently, "continues to attract attention. And now there are whispers of papers, blue ones that seem to have passed through Miss Flack's reticule." Mrs. Phipps gave a faint sniff. "If Miss Flack chooses to litter the Lord's house with scribblings, that is hardly my responsibility." "No," Purbright agreed. "Yet curious, is it not, how frequently your own name arises whenever those slips are mentioned? Some suppose you set her up, others that she serves you." Mrs. Phipps straightened. "I do not serve through intermediaries, Inspector. When I have something to say, I say it plainly. As for loyalty, if you are hinting at staff disloyalty, then perhaps you should speak to my assistant. Young Ada has been unusually restless of late." It was not quite a confession, nor was it a denial. Purbright inclined his head. "I may do so, and perhaps you might consider, Mrs. Phipps, that loyalty is seldom secured by firmness alone." Her lips tightened, and she turned away, busying herself with rearranging teacups. The conversation was at an end. From the Queen's Rest, Purbright proceeded to the small terraced house of Miss Flack. She received him with a nervous flutter, ushering him into a parlour that smelt faintly of lavender and mothballs. "I'm sure you've heard dreadful tales," she began breathlessly, "but I assure you, Inspector, those slips of paper were not mine. I don't know how they came to be in my bag. I suspect," she added with sudden vehemence, "that Grimmett had something to do with it. He's always fussing near the choir loft, pretending to straighten hymnals." "Indeed," Purbright said, studying her, "and what purpose would Mr. Grimmett have in supplying you with slips?" "Miss," Flack faltered. "To embarrass me, of course, to make me appear foolish. He has never forgiven me for winning the best chrysanthemum at the horticultural show 3 years ago." Purbright suppressed a sigh. In Flaxborough, motives for malice were seldom grander than chrysanthemums. Yet the inspector did not dismiss her claim outright. Pettiness, when sufficiently nurtured, could grow into something far more disruptive. As he took his leave, his eyes fell upon the open hymn book upon Miss Flack's piano. Tucked between "Onward, Christian Soldiers" and "Guide Me, O Thou Great Redeemer," was a small square of blue paper. He drew it out delicately. It bore a single word written in hurried pencil: Wednesday. "Do you often mark your hymns this way, Miss Flack?" he asked mildly. She peered at it with dismay. "No, Inspector. That must have been planted. Again." Purbright slipped the paper into his notebook. Perhaps, or perhaps it was meant to be found. When he returned to the station, he considered all he had gathered. There were blue slips that moved like migrating birds from hand to hand. There was the nutmeg, too much or too little, always at the heart of the Queen's Rest. And now there was a date, Wednesday. "Mally," he said quietly, "find out who ordered hymn books recently, and discreetly ask the paper merchants who have purchased blue stock in the last month." "Yes, sir. You think it's connected?" Purbright gazed out of the window at the slow passage of townsfolk along the high street. "Everything is connected, Sergeant. The question is only whether we choose the right thread to follow." That night, as the lamps lit one by one across Flaxborough, The inspector reread the anonymous letter. Pay heed to the hymn book. He thought of Miss Flack's piano, of the slip inscribed with Wednesday, and of the way Mrs. Phipps's hand had trembled as she poured tea. He leaned back, the faintest glimmer of anticipation in his eyes. Wednesday, then. The play would have its next act soon enough, and Purbright intended to be seated in the stalls. Wednesday dawned with a kind of pale, watery light that gave Flaxborough a washed-out look, as if the town itself had been soaked overnight and left out to dry. The promise contained within that pencilled slip of paper weighed on Purbright's mind as he stepped from his house and made his unhurried way toward the station. To anyone who knew him, he appeared his usual self, hat tilted at a mild angle, hands clasped behind his back, his pace more amble than march. But beneath the placid exterior he was marking the hours, attentive to every stir in the life of the town. At the police station, Malley was waiting with a bundle of notes. His expression carried that particular eagerness of a man who expected his news to be important. "Sir," he began, "I spoke with the paper merchant. They confirmed Miss Flack has not bought a single sheet of blue stock in years. But," he hesitated for effect, "Mr. Grimmett ordered 3 reams of the stuff a fortnight ago, claimed it was for hymn notices." Purbright raised his eyebrows slightly. 3 dreams? That would be sufficient to hymn the whole of Yorkshire." "Exactly, sir. And the merchant says Grimmett was oddly insistent on having the exact shade. Sky blue, they call it. Very particular. Particularity, Sergeant, is often the mark of someone concealing generality." Purbright took the note and folded it neatly into his pocket. "And the hymn books?" "A new set was ordered last month, sir. Paid for out of parish funds. Delivered directly to the church office. Grimmett signed for them." So Grimmett's hand appeared again, fussing near the choir loft, acquiring large quantities of blue paper, signing for hymn books. Purbright did not permit himself a conclusion, but he let the patterns settle in his mind like stones arranging themselves on a riverbed. Later that morning he strolled into the Queen's Rest. The Teashop had acquired a brittle kind of calm, like a drawing-room after a quarrel. Customers drank their tea in more silence than usual, their ears pricked for the next morsel of scandal. Behind the counter, Mrs. Phipps moved with studied serenity. "Inspector," she greeted, her tone clipped, "I trust you have come to tell me this nonsense will soon be over." "On the contrary," Purbright replied gently, "it seems to have entered an interesting phase. Tell me, Mrs. Phipps, do you often keep track of church matters?" She frowned. "Certainly not. My concern is my tea shop, not hymns." "Curious," he said softly, "because one cannot help but notice that your assistant, young Ada, has been seen conversing quite freely with Mr. Grimmett of late." Her eyes narrowed. "Ada is impressive. He flatters her. She's too young to understand how small men make themselves seem large by whispering." Purbright did not comment. He only sipped the tea she had set before him, nutmeg-laced, though whether excessive or restrained he could not say, and let her words linger in the air. It was a small confession, if one listened for the creak in the voice, the slight emphasis on "too young." That afternoon, Purbright made his way to the church, where Grimmett was indeed to be found arranging hymn books with exaggerated care. "Good morning, Mr. Grimmett," Purbright said pleasantly. "I wonder if you might indulge me with a small tour of your domain." Grimmett beamed the ingratiating smile of a man accustomed to being both indispensable and unnoticed. "Certainly, Inspector. Always happy to show the order we keep here. Discipline and tidiness, those are the marks of a devout parish." They walked slowly along the pews. Purbright's eyes noted everything. The sharpness of the fold in Grimmett's trousers, the way his hand lingered too long on the hymn book spines, the faint blue edge of paper protruding from one volume. He let it pass without remark. "I understand," said Purbright conversationally, "that you purchased a good deal of blue paper recently." Grimmett's smile stiffened. "Yes, Inspector. Notices, as you say. For choir practices, vestry meetings. One must be organised." "Indeed. Organisation can be admirable." Purbright paused, his gaze settling on a lectern. "But one wonders, Mr. Grimmett, why notices should be tucked into hymnals rather than pinned to a board." Grimmett's face coloured slightly. "A mistake, Inspector. Some mischievous boy, no doubt." "Perhaps," Purbright murmured, though boys seldom write Wednesday in a grown man's hand. For the first time, Grimmett faltered. He recovered quickly, but the brief flicker did not escape the inspector's notice. That evening, as lamps glowed again along the high street, the promised Wednesday revelation came. It arrived not in thunder, but in the subdued scandal of a vestry meeting. The gathering, called to discuss minor repairs, descended into uproar when one of the hymn books produced a flutter of blue slips across the floor. Each bore a single word: change. Miss Flax shrieked. Mrs. Phipps's assistant Ada turned scarlet, and Grimmet, bending hastily to gather the papers, collided with the verger and toppled a candlestick. The scene was absurd enough to satisfy Flaxborough's appetite for months, yet to Purbright it was more than comedy. It was proof that someone was planting signals, cryptic but deliberate. Later, outside in the cool night, Mally asked, "What do you make of it, sir?" "Change? Is it some code?" "Perhaps," Purbright replied, watching Grimmet fuss and fume by the church door. "Or perhaps it is exactly what it says. Someone wishes for a change. Leadership, loyalty, and custom. It would be wise, Sergeant, to consider who stands to gain most from upheaval." He did not add aloud the thought forming in his mind, that Flaxborough's scandals, however small, rarely grew without nourishment, and somewhere, behind nutmeg, hymnals, and blue slips, someone was feeding this one carefully. The scandal of the vestry meeting had not yet cooled when Flaxborough woke the next morning, tongues wagging with renewed vigour. To some, the sight of Mr. Grimmet sprawling on the floor amongst scattered slips of blue paper had been worth the weight of a decade. To others, the word printed upon them, change, hinted at upheavals far beyond the misplacement of hymnals. By breakfast it was said that the bishop himself would descend to demand explanations, while at the same time Mrs. Phipps was accused in certain circles of orchestrating the entire business to distract from her tea-shop's declining sponge quality. Purbright, listening to this tide of speculation, sat at his desk with quiet patience. Mally read aloud snippets of reports gathered from various informants, some official, others the sort who could not resist, making themselves useful whenever a whisper passed their way. One story says, Mally recited, that the blue slips were part of a love message between Ada and some mysterious suitor. Another says Grimmet planted them to embarrass Miss Flack, and Mrs. Phipps swears on her reputation that neither she nor her tea-shop has anything to do with it. Purbright's fingers tapped lightly on the blotter. If a lady must swear upon her reputation, Sergeant, it generally means she fears she has less of it left than she would like. He rose and strolled to the window, gazing upon the square where townsfolk already lingered in knots of conversation, the blue paper serving as both subject and prop in their gossip. One woman even waved a slip like a flag, declaiming loudly to her neighbour that it was a political plot. "Order the slips collected, Sergeant," Purbright said calmly. "Not for their ink nor their paper, but for where they are found. Distribution may tell us what intention cannot." By midday, Mally had assembled a neat bundle of the offending slips, each labelled with its place of discovery. Most had fluttered onto the vestry floor, but a few were discovered in pew racks, and one lodged beneath the organ pedals. Purbright studied them without expression, then tucked them away. That afternoon, he visited Ada at her lodgings, a narrow terrace house with lace curtains that trembled at his approach, betraying a watching eye. Ada, when she appeared, looked both frightened and flattered by his attention. "I never wrote a word of it, Inspector," she insisted before he had asked. I only helped carry some hymn books one evening. Mr. Grimmet said it would be a kindness. I didn't know there were papers hidden inside." "Did you ask him why he needed your help?" Purbright's tone was mild. "No, sir. I thought he was just being friendly. He said I was clever with my hands." She blushed, then bit her lip. "But I don't want trouble. Mrs. Phipps would never forgive me if my name were dragged into this." Purbright assured her quietly that names, once dragged, could often be restored with a little polish, and withdrew. Her nervousness was genuine. He doubted she had contrived anything more complicated than carrying a tray of scones. From there he proceeded to Miss Flack's sitting room, where the lady received him with a mix of indignation and triumph. "I told you, Inspector," she declared, "that man Grimmet is not to be trusted. Now the whole town sees his tricks. Change, indeed. Change is what we require. A new parish clerk, honest and upright." "You see it as a campaign?" Purbright asked gently. "Of course it is a campaign." "Do you think these things happen by accident? Somebody plotted to stir up a scandal, to cast doubt upon the order of the church. It must be him. He covets authority. Purbright inclined his head, but inwardly he noted her eagerness. A woman who smelt victory too keenly was as untrustworthy as one who denied guilt too hastily. By evening the inspector had returned to his office, where Mally waited with more tidings. "Sir, word is spreading that Grimmett means to resign. He's been seen pacing outside the church, pale as a ghost. Some say he's frightened the bishop really will intervene." Purbright considered this in silence. A resignation would be neat, too neat. And in Flaxborough, neatness was always suspicious. He took his coat once more and walked the quiet lanes to the vicarage. Inside the study he found the Reverend Trowse looking weary but resigned. The clergyman admitted he had spent the better part of the day fielding visits from parishioners offering both comfort and complaint. "I do not understand it, Inspector," he said, rubbing his temples. "Blue paper, cryptic words, scandal in the choir loft. It is unbecoming of a parish. Grimmett swears he is innocent, yet his manner convinces nobody. Miss Flack insists upon new elections. I had hoped for peace, but it seems I am granted none." Purbright's reply was slow, measured. Peace, Reverend, is sometimes disturbed not by enemies but by those who most loudly claim to defend it. Tell me, who among your flock would benefit from change? The vicar hesitated. Miss Flack, perhaps. She has long envied Grimmett's position, and Mrs. Phipps, though I cannot see why a tea-shop should concern itself with vestry affairs. Envy and commerce are not so different, Purbright remarked softly. Both concern themselves with profit. He left soon after, content to let the vicar stew upon the matter. Outside the night was still, yet within that stillness the inspector felt a quiet stirring. The affair was not merely the work of an officious clerk or a meddlesome spinster. Someone was playing a longer game, using blue slips and whispered rumours as pawns. The following morning the town was electrified by a fresh scandal. A notice had appeared pinned to the church door, written in the same bold hand on the same blue paper. It bore no single word this time, but a phrase, "The old order must go." A small crowd gathered, muttering in tones half fearful, half delighted. Children craned to read, elders shook their heads, and one man predicted revolution before the week was out. Purbright arrived, surveyed the notice without surprise, and said mildly to Mally, "You see, Sergeant, yesterday's change was but a rehearsal. This is the declaration. Whoever writes these wishes not mischief alone, but displacement. The question is displacement of whom, and for whose benefit?" Mally asked if they should demolish it. Purbright shook his head. "None believe it where it is. A net works better when the fish swim into it of their own accord." As he walked away, hands folded behind his back, Purbright knew the town would do the rest. Gossip would fan the flames, suspects would reveal themselves by their urgency or their silence, and before long the true instigator would be compelled to step forward. By the time Sunday bells rang, the pinned notice had become the town's chief topic, surpassing even the mystery of Mrs. Sowerby's vanished bicycle, or the scandalous rise in the price of custard powder. A phrase as blunt and audacious as "the old order must go" seemed to lift Flaxborough out of its usual gossip and thrust it into the sphere of politics, revolution, or at least the more melodramatic pages of the local newspaper. Inside the tea shop, business thrived as never before. Patrons who normally nursed a single cup of weak tea now lingered for hours, ordering second slices of Battenberg in exchange for the right to argue loudly about the culprit. Mrs. Phipps, flushed but careful, bustled between tables with exaggerated serenity, as though proving by her brisk good humour that her establishment had nothing whatever to do with the matter. Yet her eyes darted anxiously each time someone spoke her name, and she more than once dropped a plate with unnecessary force when the discussion strayed too near Ada's supposed involvement. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, treated the sudden storm of conjecture with the same measured calm he reserved for his correspondence with headquarters about petrol coupons. He sat in his office, spectacles perched low on his nose, reading each collected account Mally had assembled about the second notice. 2 witnesses, Mally reported, say they saw a shadowy figure by the church door after dark, but one swears it was Grimmett, while the other is just as sure it was a woman in a hat. "A hat," Purbright repeated, not looking up. "Most of Flaxborough wear one when venturing out. The detail is less than helpful." Mally pressed on. "There's also talk that Miss Flack was overheard boasting of change coming, though she denies it. and Mrs. Phipps is now hinting that her rival, Mrs. Dabb, had a hand in it to harm her business. Purbright's lips curved in the faintest smile. A revolution instigated for the purpose of suppressing tea-shop custom would be a novelty. Still, in Flaxborough, commerce and conscience are often linked. That afternoon, he made another slow circuit through the town. He noted the groupings, Miss Flack holding forth to a knot of sympathetic parish ladies, Grimmett skulking near the apothecary with an expression of noble injury, Mrs. Phipps gliding from table to table with apologies, and Ada peeping nervously from her lodgings window. Each played a part, yet the performance as a whole revealed more than any actor alone. In the evening, Purbright invited the principal characters to a quiet consultation at the police station. He couched it as a chance to clarify matters before the bishop's rumoured intervention. The vicar, obliged to attend, sat anxiously at one end of the table, while Grimmett, Miss Flack, Mrs. Phipps, and Ada occupied chairs in varying states of indignation. Mally stood in the corner, notebook ready but looking as though he expected little more than an outbreak of shrill recriminations. Purbright, however, was unhurried. He began by laying out the slips of blue paper, then the pinned notice. He asked each person what they knew about handwriting. Predictably, denials came thick and fast, though Miss Flack allowed herself the suggestion that it bore a certain clerkly neatness, which made Grimmett redden to his ears. "I should remind you," Purbright said mildly, "that while the choice of paper and phrase may appear theatrical, the act itself is a serious attempt to disrupt the parish's order. Disorder is not, as some imagine, harmless amusement. It corrodes." There was silence, broken only by the shuffle of feet. Purbright turned at last to Mrs. Phipps, who had so far spoken little. "Madam," he said, "your tea-shop has, by no choice of your own, become the arena where this affair is most discussed. Do you consider yourself harmed or benefited by it?" Her cheeks coloured. "Inspector, I will not pretend my till has not rung merrily these past days. But I value reputation above profit. I do not want customers who come merely to gawk and whisper." Purbright inclined his head. "Yet reputation, like profit, can sometimes be increased by a little scandal, if only one knows when to feign indignation and when to let rumour swell." She flinched, but said nothing. Grimmett seized the break to declare he had been made a scapegoat. He had served the parish faithfully, he cried, and if others wished to usurp him, let them be honest enough to stand for election rather than hiding behind scraps of blue stationery. "An eloquent defence," Purbright said, "but you will forgive me if I consider not only words but circumstances. It was you, Mr. Grimmett, who had access to hymn books and vestry cupboards where slips might be hidden. It was you who persuaded Ada here to assist, thereby entangling her, whether innocently or not." Ada gasped, and Miss Flack murmured a triumphant, "There!" But Purbright raised a hand. "And yet," he continued, "I find it curious that the handwriting does not match yours, Mr. Grimmett. You have a round, clerkly hand. These letters are angular, almost theatrical. One might almost think they were written by someone eager to imitate an official tone but lacking the discipline of the clerk's desk." His eyes moved gently to Miss Flack, who drew herself up, lips pressed thin. "Inspector, if you suggest—" "I suggest only," Purbright interrupted softly, "that a person who speaks much of change and has long opposed another's position may, in a moment of zeal, believe herself justified in using stratagems. Miss Flack, your eagerness betrayed you before your pen did." The room held its breath. Miss Flack trembled, then protested shrilly, but her words collapsed under the weight of Purbright's calm recital of her boasts, her opportunity to access the church during choir practice, and the simple truth that the first set of slips had been distributed from hymnals stacked in her own pew. At last, she sank into silence, fury and humiliation mingling in her eyes. Purbright closed the matter without triumph. "There will be no charge, provided no further such disturbances occur. The parish will decide in its own time whether it wishes to change, but Flaxborough has had sufficient excitement for the present." When the meeting dispersed, townsfolk departed subdued, though one or two could be heard whispering already of Miss Flack's downfall and Mrs. Phipps's relief. Later, alone in his office, Purbright wrote his report in his slow, precise hand. He reflected that the scandal had proved less about crime than about ambition, less about malice than vanity. In Flaxborough, that was crime enough. He signed his name placed the papers neatly in the file, and with the faintest smile returned to the pile of routine correspondence waiting patiently on his desk. In the week that followed the disclosure, Flaxborough settled back into the rhythm it liked to imagine was eternal. The parish notice board stood newly scrubbed, its clean surface as blank and innocent as though no incendiary message had ever been tacked to it. The vicar, much relieved, returned to sermons on duty and thrift, careful not to glance too often towards the pew usually occupied by Miss Flack. Miss Flack herself adopted a pained air of martyrdom, claiming privately to confidants that she had been misinterpreted, and publicly that she suffered from an unfortunate penmanship. Her circle of allies diminished but did not vanish. Flaxborough was a place where obstinacy was often confused with virtue, and a few admired her sheer determination to hold her ground even after exposure. Grimmett, meanwhile, regained his footing with smug swiftness, speaking loftily of forgiveness, and suggesting that, after all, the matter had best be forgotten. This did not prevent him from recounting the story at least twice a day in the Teashop, with embellishments that cast himself in an ever more heroic light. He hinted darkly that Purbright had privately confided suspicions of treachery to him, and though no one believed the claim entirely, they were willing to nod politely for the sake of the biscuits. Mrs. Phipps discovered that scandal, when carefully managed, could be as profitable as a glowing review in the Mercury. Her tables filled steadily. Even those who claimed to deplore all the fuss somehow found their feet, leading them to her door. She took pains to appear both modest and vigilant, ensuring each pot of tea was accompanied by a remark about keeping one's standards despite everything. Ada, restored to her quiet life, emerged oddly more self-assured. The brief suspicion cast upon her seemed to harden her resolve, and she no longer allowed customers to treat her as a convenient ear for gossip. One bold remark from her about people writing things they dare not say silenced a table for a full half-hour. Through it all, Inspector Purbright observed with the same patient detachment he had shown since the affair began. When Sergeant Malley remarked one afternoon that Miss Flack had escaped lightly, Purbright merely said, "The burden of ridicule is often a harsher sentence than the law can impose." He then folded his hands across his paperwork and returned to the perennial problem of filling out supply requisitions without attracting a rebuke from county headquarters. The town, having consumed the scandal as eagerly as a plate of seed cake, gradually tired of it and turned to fresher diversions. A dispute at the allotments over tomato varieties promised the next uproar. Yet the memory lingered, the odd thrill of seeing their prime parish life disrupted by whispered revolution, the drama of public accusation, the amusement of Miss Flack's wounded pride. In the evenings, as dusk settled over the market square and the tea-shop lamps glowed like beacons of normalcy, those who passed by felt an odd comfort. Order had been disturbed, but it had been restored without lasting harm. That, in Flaxborough, was scandal enough, and so, with teapots polished, reputations bruised but not broken, and the parish once again lulled by its own respectability, Inspector Purbright closed his file on the matter. He knew, as only he could, that human frailties required no villains, merely opportunity, and that in Flaxborough, opportunity was never far away.